In 1952, a far off corner of the world, at least to the United States, became the focus of a National Geographic magazine cover story. Its title, Indochina Faces the Dragon. Indochina, of course, referred to, in part, Vietnam. And in 1952, the United States was secretly funding 90% of the French colonial war to keep Vietnam, Indochina, in its sphere of influence. Little did we know in 1952 that in less than 10 years the United States would become more and more involved after the French pulled out and the US decided, in the name of containment, to take over the French role in fighting against communist rebels who came to rise after the French departure and Vietnam being split into two separate northern and southern regions. By 1965, after Lyndon Johnson became president, he made many fateful decisions. While a great advocate for the civil rights movement, Johnson decided to get the United States more deeply involved in Vietnam, whereas his predecessor, John F. Kennedy, had been leaning towards perhaps de-escalating our rather minimal involvement with advisor, quote-unquote, advisor, military advisor levels peaking at 16,000 in 1963. After a fateful event called the Gulf of Tonkin incident, Johnson decided he was going to ramp up U.S. involvement in the war, and eventually the United States would take on the burden of fighting this war of protection against the communist menace in the name of containment for the South Vietnamese and against the North Vietnamese enemy in the communist Southern Vietnamese, Viet Cong. By 1965, the United States was becoming more deeply involved, and Life magazine, week after week, would cover major news events in the United States and around the world. The topic for this July 1965 article was the United States getting deeper and deeper into the war. And while the cover shows hardships, casualties, the reality of the brutality, Life magazine's editorial took a stance somewhat opposed to the implications of the cover. The hard realities of power demand that we must fight on. Life magazine was clearly a champion of the policy of containment. Enter General William Westmoreland in February of 1965, who became commander of U.S. combat forces in Vietnam as escalation began to take place. Little did the nation know in 1965 that by 1968, just 3 years later, U.S. troop commitments to Vietnam would rise to 580,000, many of those combat troops being draftees. February 1965 Life magazine cover shows a North Vietnamese stamp where the North Vietnamese military, proudly in their propaganda message, shoots down a United States Army helicopter, indicating that the determination of the Viet Cong enemy, the communist North Vietnamese enemy, needed to become more and more a part of U.S. policy. Blows, counterblows, tense weights, and the United States was determined to see the mission through. Supposedly on October 22, 1965, according to Time magazine, we were reaching a turning point in Vietnam. In other words, that U.S. military might, strategy, tactics, superior equipment, and the strength of will would see the day through, and that the war was beginning to be won. Life magazine chimed in February of 1966 with an editorial, Vietnam, the war is worth winning, as doubts among the general population, still a minority, began to rise as to whether or not it was worth fighting for. Anti-war movement in its infancy in 1965 began to grow in 1966. But still, Life stayed on board with the mainstream message. And in August of 1965, just about 1 year after the fateful Gulf of Tonkin incident, America's readers were again shown by the cover, reminded that our military might, our prowess, our technology, and our previous victory in World War II would see the mission through. The mighty fleet lashes out on South China Sea, and the vigilant eyes of trained American naval personnel and high-tech equipment would certainly win the day, would they not? Meanwhile, the draft is becoming ever more a present force, and younger people in the country begin to doubt the wisdom of the war after they have to pay the price by being taken out of their colleges, off of their high school campuses right after graduation, and being put into the United States military. The draft, who beats it and how? Protest movements begin to rise. No, it's not yet the anti-war hippies. These are still relatively clean-cut young folks who are beginning to doubt the wisdom of the war that America has decided to see through. Students for a Democratic Society, Stop the Bombing, End the War. And the flames of fury against the war begin to rise. October 1966, Life magazine still chronicles the harsh, brutal realities of the Vietnam War on the cover. Invasion, demilitarized zone runs into the Marines. And of course, our brave, well-trained, remarkable Marines are the ones that are going to slug it out. Marines being mostly enlistees, dedicated to the proposition. But it would take a lot more than the grit, sacrifice, blood, guts, and determination of America to bring down the enemy. It would take changing the will of these two men, Premier Pham Van Dong of North Vietnam and Ho Chi Minh, leader of the North Vietnamese and South Vietnamese Communist movement, Uncle Ho they called him, who prophetically said to the United States after wearing down the French, "It is you who will tire first." Peace drive aimed at these two men would go nowhere. 3 years later, in 1969, the only accomplishment between negotiating parties, United States, North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the Viet Cong, would be to agree upon the shape of the peace table and who would sit where. The strategy was simple. They were going to wear us down. Enter Walter Cronkite, whom you'll hear more of later. The most trusted man in America, the evening anchor of CBS News, one of the mainstay, reliable news sources in the United States, along with the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Time, and Life magazine. The power of television would soon come to bear in terms of how things would be covered after what would be known as the 1968 Tet Offensive. General William Westmoreland still waging the battle in 1966. The question, does he have a recipe for victory? The answer, you'll find out more later as the war drags on and U.S. troop commitments grow. Ho Chi Minh, the chances for peace, fleeting at best for reasons already discussed, 1967. Still, life puts on the show of American military might, prowess, will, guts, as our Navy patrols the Mekong River outside of Saigon, the capital. And then the same month, 2 months later, 1967, battle jump. U.S. Marines, gutsy on the front, waging our will to win, showing our troop strength. Life magazine's classic cover in August of 1967, "To keep a village free." There indeed is the motive for our war in Vietnam. To keep a village free would take more than just a rifle and some friendliness. A fishing expedition, in a way, is what Vietnam was. A close look at this Life cover wholly in support of the war in August of '67, suggests that maybe, just maybe, these crutches were provided for convenience, or maybe this young man just couldn't get the right equipment. Woe betide, it wouldn't be long. October 20th, life takes another hard look at the reality, the news, that forms people's perceptions, this time about prisoners in North Vietnam. Perhaps peace negotiations could bring them home. Perhaps the war was worth winning at the peace table or on the battlefield. Inside the cone of fire at CONTAINMENT, brave Marines slug it out. Will, ways, the means, the determination. 1967. We've been in it deeper and deeper for 5 years, with much more to come. Who will tire first? And then, disaster. Life reports, the straight news. Suicide raid on the embassy during what is known as the Tet Offensive. The Tet Offensive is a 100-city coordinated attack throughout South Vietnam by North Vietnamese military and Viet Cong. This is a Viet Cong prisoner. They take the embassy in Saigon, the capital, the most strongly guarded and protected building inside Saigon, hit by the enemy. Suicide sappers get their way into the compound, and Marines have to fight them off. All 19 of the suicide sappers would meet their fate, including 2 embassy personnel, trusted, had been there for a decade or more, Barney and Suck Mao. A Marine's personal account to me some years ago said that Barney and Suck Mao were hardcore Viet Cong. They had won the trust, the hearts, and the minds of the American embassy personnel. The Tet Offensive was to create a seismic shift in perceptions of the war. The battle at Khe Sanh during Tet became a set-piece, traditional World War II style battle. President Johnson had a battlefield terrain map at Khe Sanh, and we were to hold Khe Sanh surrounded by 20,000 enemy troops with 6,000 Marines dug in inside the firing zone at all costs. And indeed, we would hold. But would American fate in the war remain the same? Life magazine continues its bold and daring, generally factful coverage of Vietnam, and yet there's something different about the focus of this cover, as Tet is still ongoing but winding down. We are taking a picture of the enemy. The enemy lets us do it for whatever reasons, propaganda reasons they have. And suddenly life takes the bold step of publishing enemy pictures. An enemy picture showing a reenactment of the capturing of a surrendered U.S. tank during Tet, giving a clear impression of who's in control and who's winning. As a female news photographer inside enemy lines prepares to load her lens, her compatriot takes this photo of our adversaries. Life magazine is beginning to change its tune, along with much of the rest of the nation. By January of 1969, with Tet as a memory, but an impact still profoundly lodged in the minds of Americans, Life magazine reruns this photo, the capture piece, the definitive photo, showing a side of the war that certainly wouldn't be the same side that Life would have shown just 3 or 4 years earlier. And it's not long before we see that Life magazine has truly changed its mind on the war, changed its opinion on the war. For they give us an extraordinary photo documentary Vietnam, 1 week's dead in June of 1969. 1 week of American soldiers who gave their lives for the cause, for the country, for the policy of containment, for Lyndon Johnson's war based on deceit, doubt, and misconception. 1 week of dead Americans. And yes, it's quite intentional that life wanted this to look like a high school yearbook. For many of these brave soldiers who died in that faraway land were taken from their high schools. Didn't have much time to celebrate graduation, for if they were drafted, they had to go. And if they enlisted, they chose to go. 1 week's dead. And the emphasis now of mainstream American press is no longer simply on the we're going to stay the course and win it. By May of 1970, life continues its Vietnam focus on the plight, the tragedy of those who were over there, made it home, and weren't treated well by the system. By 1972, the war is winding down. Richard Nixon is close, only 4 years later, of living up to his promise to bring peace with honor and get America out of Vietnam. And again, life, mainstream media, focuses on something that would not have been the same focus before Tet. And then what Ho Chi Minh hoped for to be the inevitable, Life magazine covers it in bold red lettering. And now we know exactly why Walter Cronkite said what he would say. As the end is near and the U.S. realizes that we did the best we could.